For decades, the man sold you on one simple, terrifying story: legalize weed and crime will skyrocket. It was the boogeyman every prohibitionist, politician, and police chief trotted out to scare you. We were warned about waves of violence, theft, and drug-fueled chaos in the streets. We still are. By Dr. Ben Carson as of September 2025. This powerful narrative, more drugs, even a simple plant, equals more crime, was presented as a fundamental truth, shaping laws and fueling public policy for decades. But what if their entire story was wrong? What if it was all just political bias based on fear and dogma and not facts? Well, I'm Tom Howard, a lawyer who has to prove facts in court from time to time. And before I ever passed the bar, I was a political science major who spent an unhealthy amount of time with statistical models and regression analysis. And when you ignore political talking points and actually follow the data from over a decade or more of legalization, the story isn't just different. It's often the opposite because you had dogmatic investment in the lie. I was not the best party guest in college. Therefore, today we're diving into actual numbers. We have 5 data-backed, surprising ways legal marijuana may actually be making us safer by lowering crime. Except for the last one, we're going to have one outlier. Likes and subscribes for that, people, and let's dig into it. Number 1, freeing up the front lines. First, the most obvious point: legalizing cannabis frees up police to do their actual jobs. Or at least you think that would happen, but Illinois is weird. For example, raw cannabis smell means that you have probable cause to search a vehicle because it is supposed to be in a smell-proof container. However, burnt cannabis smoke is not probable cause because cannabis is legal in Illinois. And hemp is openly competing against the cannabis market, making the whole thing, to borrow a legal term, bananas. For the states that actually have regulated cannabis all the same, for example, Michigan, before legalization, chasing marijuana users was a massive drain on law enforcement resources. Now, let's be precise. According to a landmark ACLU report back in 2010, arrests for marijuana possession made up over half of all drug arrests in the United States. Half. And it was not for trafficking. 88 of those arrests were for simple, non-violent possession. Think about what that means in practical terms. That's millions of police hours spent on paperwork, court appearances, and processing minor offenses. It's millions of taxpayer dollars spent on something that's now sold in a brightly lit store down the street. Every single officer spending their shift writing up a college kid for a dime bag was an officer not investigating a burglary or a domestic assault or a homicide. If you want to be tough on crime and for law and order, you want weed regulated and legal. As the former police chief for Washington, D.C., Kathy Lanier, once bluntly put it, all those arrests do is make people hate us. The moment states legalize, an entire category of crime all but vanishes overnight. The numbers are striking. The Colorado Division of Criminal Justice reported that between 2012 and 2019, total marijuana-related arrests in the state fell by a staggering 68%. And it's not just them. Washington, California, Oregon, and Alaska have all seen similar drops after they legalized it. Now, this isn't just about making fewer arrests. It's about reallocating finite resources. In 2018, a study of the Journal of Police Quarterly dug into this. Now, I know what you're thinking. Police Quarterly as a journal? I know, right? It found that after legalization, in both Colorado and Washington, police departments were able to solve more serious offenses. In some cases, clearance rates are the percentage of a reported case that actually results in arrest. Those increased for property crimes like burglary and vehicle theft. Now, the effect wasn't uniform across every single precinct because, reality is pretty complex and all, but the initial findings confirm a simple, common sense idea. When you stop telling people to hunt for nonviolent pot smokers, they got a lot more time to hunt for actual criminals. Now, it's the type of shocker that police unions don't seem to get by arguing that the smell of marijuana should always stay probable cause, even after legalization. If only they would use those noses to to solve actual crimes nationwide. Number 2, hitting the cartels where it hurts. Now let's follow the money. For half of a century, our federal drug policy was basically a multi-billion-dollar price support program for violent international criminal organizations. By making cannabis illegal, the government guaranteed a monopoly for violent drug cartels and high prices. Trafficking marijuana was a cornerstone of their business model. Prices were thousands of dollars a pound. Every dollar spent on the illicit market was a dollar that could buy weapons, fuel turf wars, and also buy more drugs to continue to spread those throughout the street. It would perpetuate a cycle of horrific violence. However, legalization strikes a direct and devastating blow to that economic engine, just like it did to bootleggers with the end of alcohol prohibition. When a state creates a regulated market, consumers get a safe, tested, and legal alternative to the guy. Local tax-paying businesses start competing directly with those criminals. Those criminals do use legal prices to set their prices and avoid on taxes, yada, yada. But as a result, the illicit market shrinks. Don't take my word for it. Data from the United States Border Patrol shows a dramatic and sustained drop in marijuana seizures at the southwest border as more states have come online. Now, that may be because cartels started exporting our better weed or growing it locally and then just inverting it into the legal market or shipping it online as hemp. Still, this economic disruption appears to be directly linked to a reduction in violence. Here's a crucial distinction the fearmongers always miss. A landmark 2021 Cato Institute study found that the initial wave of medical marijuana laws in states that border Mexico was associated with a 13% reduction in overall violent crime. This included a 19% drop in robberies, a 10% drop in murder, and the most shocking statistic of it all, homicides specifically tied to the drug trade plummeted by 41%. The logic is pretty straightforward. When you start to take away the profits from a violent and illicit market, you reduce the incentive for that violent and illicit market. Recreational legalization and the quasi-legal hemp market built upon this foundation, further disrupting a business model that thrived on prohibition. Let's bring it federal. And, since we're talking about prohibition, moving on to number 3, the alcohol substitution effect. It's called substitution. That's basically a polite way of saying, you're in the market for a drug, you can have this or that. And typically, it was always alcohol. Now, in some states, you can use cannabis instead of alcohol. And if you substitute cannabis for alcohol, you probably consume less alcohol. Hence, big alcohol concerned about their plummeting sales, if you've seen that in the news recently, and the skyrocketing sales of hemp seltzers. And as you're watching this, you probably have some experience with the plant, and so that you know that if you are chilling on the couch and stoned, you are way less likely to get into a bar fight. It's a cold, hard, data-backed fact. Alcohol is the undisputed champion of turning disagreements into assaults. It lowers inhibitions, severely impairs judgment, and is a major factor in a massive percentage of violent crimes. Cannabis, on the other hand, is not typically associated with that kind of aggressive behavior. But you may still pig out. Alcohol gives you the munchies. Cannabis gives you the munchies. Oh well. What the data is now confirming is that when people can legally buy cannabis, some of them drink less alcohol. Multiple studies have shown that a significant number of consumers report substituting cannabis for alcohol at least some of the time. While the research on the direct causal link between these is still developing and not completely unequivocal, the potential for this shift is quite enormous. If we move from a substance heavily linked to violence and to one that is not really detrimental and may actually be a net positive for public safety, resulting in less alcohol-related crime. We do have some study out of this. Of course, we're going to look to California, where they have decades of medical or adult use. And in that study from California, over 3.5 million Kaiser Permanente Northern California patients were watched over 4 years. Researchers found sustained declines in weekly drinking and heavy episodic drinking following the passage of Prop 64 in 2016 that legalized it in the state, especially amongst those 35 to 49-year-old demographics. Since alcohol is a major driver of violence, DUIs, and other crime, substituting it with cannabis, especially when people drink less, is a straightforward win for public health and safety, with measurable potential to reduce alcohol-related crime. So, can you smell the safety that cannabis is cooking? Oh, you hate the smell of cannabis? Well, isn't that better than someone you care about being the victim of a crime related to alcohol or not related to alcohol? Don't answer that if you're trying to score brownie points with certain politicians. Anyway, moving on. Number 4, the surprising safety of dispensaries. What about the dispensaries themselves? The fear was these shops would be magnets for crime, bring chaos to our commercial districts, depress property values. But here, the data says a very different, if not opposite and complicated story. One of the most detailed studies on this, published in the Regional Science and Urban Economics Journal, looked at neighborhood-level crime data in Denver. The researchers found that opening of a recreational dispensary was associated with a roughly 19% decline in crime in the immediate area. Now, why is that? Maybe it's because something that the urban planners like to call the eyes on the street theory. Legal dispensaries aren't shady operations. They are professional, regulated businesses. They bring foot traffic, bright lighting, mandatory security, high-definition cameras on site, and the likes of that, and very often security guards. And this activity acts as a natural deterrent to street crime, which thrives in vacant, dark, desolate areas. By turning an empty storefront into a bustling, monitored business, a dispensary can actually revitalize and secure a block. Of course, it's not that simple, and stick around for number 5. The reality is actually kind of messy. The same Denver study also noted that a slight increase in property crime in adjacent neighborhoods to those dispensaries, suggesting that crime might just be displaced rather than eliminated entirely, and go commit it where they won't get caught. And other studies in other cities have found neutral or mixed results, but the data directly shatters a simplistic, fear-driven assumption that dispensaries automatically bring with them crime. Of course, now, to retort on that, number 5, where crime actually went up. Of course, there were no dispensaries that existed before, so you couldn't rob one. And now, because dispensaries do exist, that is one area where crime predictably becomes a serious problem. Violent robberies targeting the dispensaries themselves. This isn't a failure of cannabis legalization. It's a spectacular failure of mostly federal, but then very often state and local policy, because there is no federal policy, because marijuana is still a Schedule I drug, the same category as heroin. Most federally insured banks refuse to provide any services to cannabis businesses. It's like 93% of them. They are terrified to be charged with money laundering by the federal government. They don't think it's safe and sound banking practices to openly and notoriously be violating the laws of the federal government. Makes sense. This forces a multi-billion-dollar state legal industry to operate in a large amount of cash, more than it ordinarily would. Now, I want you to imagine a business with vaults full of cash and a high-value product that is legally barred from putting its money into banks. You've just created a magnet for armed robbery, especially because some states have more lax security requirements. For example, product can be all over the floor, not locked up, and many different locations, some further away from law enforcement or another security risk. So this really isn't a cannabis problem as much as it's a regulatory problem resulting primarily from too much cash. Blaming the dispensaries for getting robbed is a bit like blaming the jewelry store for having jewels and therefore getting robbed. The real culprit is a brain-dead federal policy that forces a legitimate, tax-paying industry to paint a giant bullseye on its back, especially if the local and state regulations don't require something onerous like we have here in Illinois with our dispensary. Look at our videos where we talk about our dispensary for stuff on that. But we have, I think it was last count, 32 of the state's attorneys generals begging on Congress to pass the Safer Banking Act to help these dispensaries and reduce their cash on hand, making them far less attractive targets. But the bill remains stalled, or I don't even think it's been introduced in this current Congress in 2025. So there you have it. For decades, the debate over legal marijuana was dominated by fear and propaganda. But now the data is finally coming in and the facts are starting to paint a very different picture. We've seen that freeing police from enforcing minor marijuana laws allows them to focus on more serious crimes. We've seen that legal markets hit profits of violent drug cartels. We've seen a potential shift away from alcohol, a substance far more linked to violence and crimes than marijuana. And we've seen that dispensaries themselves can sometimes make their neighborhoods safer, not more dangerous. Of course, we've also seen a new business called a dispensary, which can get robbed. The story of legal marijuana and crime is not how we're told. It's a story of how dismantling a failed federal policy can have surprising and positive consequences. But I want to know what you think. Which of these data points surprised you the most? Which ones did I miss? Let me know your take in the comments. And if you appreciate the analysis that follows actual data instead of political hype, do me a favor, smash that subscribe button, click the bell, give us a like. We're here every week cutting through the BS and trying to get to over 100,000 subscribers. And for more on these topics that you clearly enjoy if you made it this far, watch this next video starting right now.